we're going to talk today about building the pipeline. This presentation was put together by our committee, and the main workhorses for the presentation were Hannah, Liz, myself, and Morgan. And Nikhil Shah also significantly contributed to the presentation, but unfortunately is on call today, so couldn't be here to present the material that he provided. Well, my slides don't want to advance. There we go. So as we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, it's always helpful to just, discuss the fact that this is a safe space, that we will potentially be talking about sensitive issues, and that we all have different viewpoints and opinions, and this is a safe space, and what is kind of said in this environment will stay in this environment, and that we are all just here to learn together. So why does diversity matter? This is something that we're all very familiar with, but it's always good to hear it again and to think of it from different perspectives. So there's the business case. We know from the business community and the diversity bonus discussions that a workforce that is diverse and inclusive leads to increased innovation, improved problem solving, and increased collaboration. And all of that leads to increased productivity and profitability. From a medical perspective, a diverse workforce facilitates access to care, as underrepresented minorities in medicine are more likely to work in underserved communities that tend to service larger populations of minority patients and those of lower socioeconomic status. While other studies have shown that patient-provider concordance, either with regards to race, ethnicity, or gender, improves patient communication, increases collaboration, leads to shared decision-making, and ultimately improves patient care. And then there's the ethical case. And truly this is what drives me in my diversity, equity, and inclusion work, is the idea that all people should have equal access to opportunities to live their lives to their fullest and fulfill their dreams. One's potential should not be limited by their race, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and so on. So to discuss the pipeline, first we need to really understand what the population looks like and what our goal is. The AAMC highlights that an underrepresented minority in medicine is any population within medicine that doesn't have representation equal to the general population. So if we look at the population of the United States, about 60% of that population is white, 18% is Hispanic or Latino, 13% is Black, 6% is Asian, and then the numbers kind of taper off from there. This is 2018 census data. It is a bit flawed because they've included race and ethnicity, which can lead some people to have to choose between their race and ethnicity if they're Afro-Latina. But this is the data that we have. As pediatric surgeons, it's interesting to know that children are actually much more diverse than adults, with only about 50% of children being of white race and 25% being Hispanic or Latino. So our future is likely to be more diverse than our present. The surgical workforce does not represent the general population with respect to racial and ethnic makeup. So as we can see on this slide, although in medical students, actually it's not quite as bad as we get further up the line, with about 60% of medical students being white. There is overrepresentation of Asians within medicine, and then which then leads to the underrepresentation we see within the Hispanic and Black population. As we go up into more subspecialized things, and specifically into pediatric surgery, we will notice that the proportion of people of white race increases and the proportion of people of other races decreases and becomes less representative. When we look at this data, we also need to think about intersectionality to ensure that subgroups within a larger group are not left behind, and acknowledge that some challenges are unique to each population and can require intentional interventions to ensure that no one is left behind. And I think one of the most interesting examples of this from the business world is when the civil rights movement was pushing increased access to the workforce for Black persons as well as women. What ended up happening was white women were hired in secretarial and administrative roles, and Black men were hired in maintenance roles. And in the end, it completely excluded the community of Black women who did not find a place in the workforce. Women in medicine are interesting and often included in pipeline discussions. In 2022, we actually reached parity in medical school in terms of male versus female breakdowns. Clearly, we're talking about gender in the binary here, which is not perfect, but is how most statistics are collected. As we moved forward within the medical school realm, actually women began to outnumber men. But when we look at procedural subspecialties, that we're not seeing that trend continue, where we get increased representation of men as you get more subspecialized, and especially as you look at leadership over time. So within APSA, women and underrepresented minorities are increasingly being well represented, but are still very much lagging behind, especially when we look at higher levels within the organization or higher levels within pediatric surgery in general, such as the number of department chairs, the makeup of the APSA Board of Governors, and the roles of APSA presidents. Now, this is data collated from 1970 to 2018, so doesn't represent some of our more recent APSA presidents and board members. So what is the pipeline? So interesting, the concept of the STEM pipeline actually emerged in the 1970s, and it was used to describe concerns from Western countries regarding how they were going to keep up with the technology that was being developed, and the workforce needed to support that. And the thought that we needed to divert people into STEM careers to ensure that as more STEM careers were becoming available, we had a workforce to actually service that need. It wasn't until decades later that people kind of realized that not everybody that's filtered into this pipeline comes out at the end of the pipeline, and that the people that are being lost in the pipeline are being lost in a very systemic way, women and minorities, related to discrimination and such. So in pediatric surgery, people are lost all along the pipeline as well, in terms of getting to the ultimate goal of being a pediatric surgeon, as well as to becoming leaders in the field. This is a diagram from one of the DOI committee's recent publications on pipeline development, and highlights various areas where people are lost along the pipeline. Today, we're going to discuss 3 cases that highlight some of these pipeline issues, starting with issues related to mentorship of trainees. Then we're going to discuss about candidate selection and retention, and finally discuss the role of burnout in retention of attending level surgeons, and keeping people in the field, invested in the field, and healthy. And with that, I'm going to turn the discussion over to Hannah.
Thank you. I will be introducing the first case. So suppose you have a third-year medical student who recently rotated on your service, and she emails you for advice. She expresses interest in pursuing a surgical residency with the goal of specializing in pediatric surgery. She's concerned, however, because she's the first person in her family to go to medical school, and she doesn't know how to start preparing for the upcoming match or what she needs to be successful. So we thought we would open it up to the members of the board for a few minutes of discussion. I've listed a couple of discussion points on the slide. What are barriers that you see to her success? What advice might you give her about the general surgery match, or anticipatory guidance could you offer about pediatric surgery? And what type of resources might you provide her for mentorship?
Thank you, Dr. Cockrell. I will jump in. I am always really excited when medical students become excited about pediatric surgery, just for the anecdotal reason that that is the stage in my education where I became excited about pediatric surgery. And I think the anticipatory guidance at that stage that I would provide is to affirm that this is a field with lots of challenges, lots of potential education, lots of joy, but also a road where perhaps we could say the pipeline narrows. And so it becomes really important to pay attention to those factors that help people move ahead, such as performance in rotations having to do with surgery and, standardized test performance, and the ability, an important ability to think of a plan B, to remain open to other areas of medicine, which might provide her with other opportunities to have a very fulfilling professional life. Dr. Gaines?
I concur. I love it when medical students want to talk to me and I about surgery. Sometimes I like to get a little bit of kind of knowing where they're coming from. And usually there's a reason why they've sought me out, not just because they loved pediatric surgery, but particularly for women medical students, they kind of look at me and they see themselves or they a little bit in me. And so, I do like to kind of mentor them or kind of talk about a surgical career, the goods and the bads, and the fact that, I can, I've done this, and I'm also a mom and I have 3 kids and they're sort of normal, I think, at least for the most part. And that I, have gone to birthday parties and gone to sports games and those kinds of things, because I think that there is a sense that that the world's kind of black and white. You can either be a surgeon or you could be a surgeon, I like to try to let them realize that there's a lot of gray and that different surgical careers are different. But I also echo your comments that particularly if they're looking towards pediatric surgery, then there's a certain path that we know, whether it's good, bad, or bad, that it makes you more successful for a pediatric surgical career. And so doing well in rotations, doing well on standardized tests, but also being passionate about surgery. So those are the things that I talk about.
Dr. Barksdale?
So I think we all see these scenarios from our own lens or our own perspective. So you said this is a safe space. So when I look at this student who's representative, the things that come out to me are, 1, that she's female, 2, she may be potentially a ethnic minority, and 3, that she is a first generation in her family going into medicine. And many of those things I relate to from my own background. And so I see a number of students across genders with this over the years, and I often tell them to take the Buddhist approach and to be in the now. And so the first thing that he or she must do is to not focus on pediatric surgery as a career, but focus on getting into the best general surgery residency that they can. I think when people think about the length of training and think about going to lacrosse games or having a partner, it can become too overwhelming in the beginning. And so I offer them the opportunity to be a lifelong mentor, and to connect them to other people that they may identify with, who may be a better mentor at a different stage for them. But I think that we have to be so careful in mentoring young people who are trying to think about going into surgeries is getting them in the door with an idea of what the long term will be, but to focus on excellence at the next step.
Dr. Pulagandla?
Yeah, thank you. I think Dr. Barksdale really hit the nail on the head. I would first, again, as a program director, I often get students who will come because they feel that I am the point person within the division who may be able to guide them. I would certainly link them. I would have linked this female medical student probably with a female colleague, or at least given that opportunity. I also would have very much stressed what Dr. Barksdale said, is that, yes, you can think about pediatric surgery, yet there are so many steps along the way that you would need to fill in order to, sort of join and get into that. And one of those also has to be, the quality of the general surgery program that they're able to go, and also to maybe highlight the fact that there's a very traditional approach and there are non-traditional approaches into pediatric surgery. And I do believe that the non-traditional approaches to pediatric surgery are being a bit more valued nowadays than they were in the past. If you did not do 2 years of bench work, you would often not get an interview. Certainly that was the way that I was mentored when I went through it. And so I think that there are many different options. There are clinical fellowships, there are different things that they can do, but I think there are many ingredients that have to happen. And I think, again, providing that kind of support, because life gets in the way sometimes and things change. And that really is important. And what I've also done as well is along the way is I've actually tried to link these students up with senior general surgery residents who are also looking at subspecialization, not necessarily pediatric surgery, but other elements to provide that another perhaps a closer element of mentorship that might be able to be useful to them. But yeah, it's hard as a medical student saying that 8 years or 10 years down the line that you want to do pediatric surgery and trying to keep your to understand all the steps that are required to get to that spot.
Thank you, Dr. Pulagandla. To accommodate our presenters, we're going to cut the comments short at 11:35 Eastern time. So Dr. Sullins, you're the next on the list. You have about 90 seconds.
I just want to echo the sentiments. I think that as a younger attending, a lot of medical students turn to sort of the younger generation to try to get advice early on, and perhaps it's because they see something that is similar in them. So I think it's really important to validate those differences that they're concerned about, and then again to take the same approach, which is to leave your options open. But then most importantly, the advice I give them is to say, choose a passion project and something that you really care about. And then every step along the way, as long as you're excited about it, it will sort of guide you in the correct direction. And then when you're interviewing, even if you take a non-standard or non-traditional pathway, I think that that comes through in everything that you do. And whether that takes you to pediatric surgery or not, that's sort of a recipe for winning in life.
Very wise advice. Dr. Calkins, you have probably less than a minute. But you can talk fast.
I agree with everything. I like to focus on opportunities rather than barriers. There's so much opportunity that's so much different, I think, today than it was 20 years ago. So that would be my only comment, but I agree with everybody else as well.
Thank you. Dr. Cockrell, back to you.
Thank you all for the robust discussion. I'm sorry that we don't have more time to continue. The next few slides, I just wanted to go through potential barriers and opportunities to support medical students and residents who are interested in general surgery and then pediatric surgery. This slide highlights predictors of successful applications to both the general surgery and pediatric surgery matches. As you all know, both matches are considered to be highly competitive, but I would argue that some of the predictors of success in these matches may pose barriers, especially to first generation and underrepresented in medicine applicants. I think students interested in general surgery and other procedural subspecialties are expected to engage in research activities during medical school, with greater than 4 abstracts and at least 1 peer-reviewed publication being predictive of successful general surgery matches. Many conferences do offer reduced registration fees for medical student presenters. However, the cost of conference travel may be prohibitive. I looked at a number of the different large academic surgical conferences and found multiple opportunities for resident travel awards. However, there are fewer organizations that offered grant funding for medical students. The other thing is that students are encouraged to participate in away rotations at other academic medical centers. And these rotations can act as month-long auditions at programs where students would strongly consider training. Students are often encouraged to seek letters of recommendation from faculty at these other institutions to strengthen their application. But these rotations may require students to incur additional expenses for travel and housing. The AAMC does have a list of grant funding for underrepresented in medicine visiting students. So that is the resource to which we could refer students who come to us looking for advice during that stage of their training. As we've all talked about, mentorship plays an important role in attracting medical students to surgery residencies, with earlier mentorship being linked to increased interest in a career in general surgery or a surgical subspecialty. Nevertheless, most general surgery residents or applicants do not meet their faculty mentor until M3 or M4 year. I've also included on the slide an example of a structured mentorship program from Sidney Kimmel Medical College, which shows key meetings for medical students over the course of their clinical years and application cycle. I think going back to what Dr. Pulagandla was saying, when we think about mentorship, we typically think about faculty mentorship, but I would encourage us not to discount the role of surgical residents in influencing medical students' residency selections. In this study, students pursuing any surgical specialty rated residents at being better at providing useful feedback and being more encouraging of pursuing a career in their specialty. The authors did find, however, that white students pursuing a general surgery residency rated encouragement received from residents to pursue a career in the specialty to be significantly greater compared to their minority peers. The authors of this study concluded that although residents are a critical part of the student clerkship experience, attending exposure and mentoring opportunities may be more effective for increasing racial and ethnic diversity. I think it also highlights the need to diversify general surgery residencies. And that leads us into the idea of paradigmatic trajectories, or the fact that career paths that are familiar to the students are shaped by students' own life experiences and the experiences of available role models. Women and underrepresented in medicine students are frequently unable to see, identify, or interact with surgeons who look like them or share similar backgrounds. The AWS does have an underrepresented and minority mentoring program with which they partner with surgeons from the Society of Black Academic Surgeons and the Latino Surgical Society. And then on the next slide, I wanted to highlight the APGAR program, which was born out of the belief that engagement in underrepresented in medicine candidates should start early and be sustained. APGAR stands for the Alliance of Pediatric Surgeons Growing and Advancing Representation, and it was created to develop the pipeline for pediatric surgery specifically. I've included the Twitter handle on the slide. The organization provides education and professional development that's centered for pediatric surgery and uses a pod structure, with each pod comprising members from different institutions and across different stages of training to facilitate multi-level mentorship.
Excellent. Thanks, Hannah, for that discussion. We will now move on to our second case, which is going to be presented by Morgan Richards.
All right, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. All right, so now the next case is going to talk about fellowship interviews and the part of the leaky pipeline that goes from residency to fellowship. So the second case is, imagine you are a program director for a pediatric surgery fellowship program, and you've just finished interview season and you're leading your interview season debrief. As you're discussing one of your underrepresented in medicine minority or applicants, a senior partner comments, "I'm just not sure that this applicant is a good fit for our program." And others sort of nod and seem to agree. So what do you think about this question? What's your reaction? Is it problematic? If so, why might it be problematic?
It's the
And how might you
bandwagon effect.
respond?
Yeah,
What's
that's
that? Yes.
that's the bandwagon effect, right? Or there's a lot of different names for it. But I've heard this before, having been, and there's a couple of program directors on here. I think it's incumbent upon you as a program director to try to eliminate these types of discussions about candidates, especially as a senior person. And so for instance, what we do is I usually ask all of the young people to speak out before we get to all the senior people to try to prevent this from happening. But it happens, and I think you just need to be strong and have a strong voice as a program director to make sure that it doesn't.
Dr. Barksdale?
I didn't take my hand down.
Okay.
But I have something to say. I'll take my hand down. I think we have to, as a group of leaders, move away from the concept of culture fit to one of culture add. And for those of us from underrepresented minorities, I think we've often felt that we don't belong because we don't look like others, or those of us who have different gender identities or gender preference, we may not fit with the old boys or new girls. And so I think that as we think about candidates and people, what do they bring to us as opposed to how well we feel they fit into our clique, I think we'll grow.
I love that comment. You know, culture add, really important. Dr. Pulagandva?
Yeah, again, I, you know, for me, fit just means bias. I'm just being blunt. You don't fit in here because you're not like us. And that just gets my back up every single time. So whenever I hear that from colleagues, I shut them down right away. I have really advocated for faculty to do implicit bias training. And so they are mandated prior to interviews. And we actually have our first set of pediatric surgery interviews next Wednesday that they will have had to have completed at least 5 of the 17 modules prior to, and that the hope that over the interview season, they will have completed all 17 modules. And so we really tried to address that. And I love the way that Dr. Barksdale has coined it, is that it's a value add, it's culture add, it's what are you going to add to this, and as opposed to do you fit? It's like, you know, we're not trying to fit. The fit is just, for me, just again really elicits elements of bias. And well,
Dr. Arca? Oh, she disappeared. Dr. Grant?
Thanks for this question. This just made me immediately uncomfortable when it came up on the screen. I hate this word. It's so repulsive now. And I think the reason I'm so incensed by it is when I was a fellow, Dr. Newman, she wasn't yet the program director, but she pointed it out at one of our rank meetings. about some applicants and really called people out on this question of fit. And that's my comment here is I think when this comes up, and it will continue to come up in general surgery and pediatric surgery, we have to hold each other accountable. And the next person that says the word fit, ask them, what does that mean? Why is there a fit? What culture are you building? And how's this person gonna fit in with you once they match here? So it's really a big problem, but I think more people are starting to have this conversation. And I know that many fellowships are now trying to blind their application process in certain ways to try to minimize this, but it always still comes up at the rank meeting, and the rank meetings can be so important, bumping people up and down the list. So I hope everyone else develops a healthy aversion to the word fit as well.
Really important comment. Dr. Nwome, super quick comment because I'm being held accountable by our presenters.
I will forgo my comment after listening to Dr. Grant.
Thank you.
Okay, so the discussion progresses and many of your partners seem to note similar attributes about each candidate. Does this seem like it's a problem, or are you guys really good at interviewing and getting to the depths of these candidates? And how, if you're not in favor of this, how might this be mitigated? What are some strategies that you use to more strategically interview candidates?
Dr. Grant?
Oops, I failed to put my hand down, but I don't think I understand the question. What do you mean similar attributes about each candidate?
Meaning everyone says, it talks about one person's research, or they all talk about the fact that somebody likes fly fishing. All of the interviews seem to center on the same sorts of attributes about each candidate.
Dr. Gaines?
Positive or negative attributes?
We have started.
What is meant by attributes?
I mean, is it a positive or negative attribute that you're worried about?
Maybe not necessarily positive or negative, but it seems that you're not getting a broad look at your candidates.
We have tried to use some standardized questions. We don't standardize the entire interview, but strategically, for example, having one person be the one who is focused on the research and someone else kind of discussing leadership and someone else discussing a different attribute and trying, again, we haven't standardized the entire interview, but the idea that there are designated people who are exploring particular attributes.
Perfect. All right. So the meeting concludes and you're really happy about your top 5 applicants. What are your next steps as a program director? As how many people on the call would call their network of colleagues to validate the top of the rank list? And if you do, are there any issues or potential pitfalls of that?
Dr. Puligandla?
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, based on your personal experience, we've been burned before where a candidate was not as advertised. So my top 10, I call recent program directors, general surgery program directors to really to try to get anything that could come out that wasn't perhaps put into their reference letter. I think that that's just due diligence. I think there's an element, but I think there's also opportunities in order to sort of get a little bit more information and that face-to-face contact where I think people who are vetting a particular candidate can actually, provide a bit more in-depth information that will actually consolidate your decision that this person is truly a top 5 candidate and that all of your concerns are alleviated for many, in different aspects.
Dr. Nwome?
I don't make calls about any set of candidates because I believe that if you have to make a call about any candidate, you should make a call about everybody. I just, I think it's just a matter of being fair. However, if the ranking committee raises an issue, sometimes some letters of recommendation about certain candidates might be unclear, for example, about their technical skills. So if there are particular issues that are raised and the ranking committee says to me, can you please make a call to clarify this specific issue? Then I will make a call about that. But I don't routinely make a call about one candidate and then not make a call about the other candidates.
Dr. Arca?
I think the due diligence questions is something that we almost always did when we're vetting pediatric surgery fellows, just because this person is going to be your junior partner for 2 years, and I think we're shying away from it and all that stuff, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily a bad thing. I think one of the things that you can do is, if you really want to continue to do it, is first of all, not ask for bad things, but ask for good things that person has had. And also, if there are other things and you really think that this person is, your favorite candidate, maybe you can ask the people who've known them and lived with them for 5 to 7 years. Well, how would you mitigate, any shortcomings, or how are you mitigating the shortcomings that you have very subtly referenced in your letter, buried in 700 words or less? So it should not. I think it shouldn't be oh my gosh, a stamp, do not resuscitate, do not rank, but it should be a way to be more engaged and more forwardly engaged in this person that you think is going to be a phenomenal person to train as a pediatric surgeon. It is almost like a handoff, if you would, from their general surgery training to pediatric surgery training. I mean, they're graduating this person. They need to be able to say, hey, this is the best candidate that, that we can have. So that due diligence can be a double-edged sword. So I would just think about that.
All right, Dr. Sullins has to be our last question.
I agree. I think it's really sticky. Everybody kind of does it, but then you have to kind of focus on what information you're trying to gain, and not just, hey, tell me all the skeletons in the closet. And also you have to be aware that when you're calling another person, you're just sort of compounding the implicit bias if there hasn't been additional bias training or awareness on the other side of your phone call. So I think that's something just to be aware of. Not that the phone calls shouldn't be made, because I think there is information to be gained, but it's sticky.
Okay,
Thank you.
excellent. Those were fantastic points and exactly what we're looking for. And that those phone calls, just to finalize that, I think it is important to kind of do that vetting. On the other hand, you may be selecting people who are part of a club already, if they're already part of your network, if they're already part of they've gone to pedigrees where you have contacts, that could potentially unfairly disadvantage people on your rank list. So I think being very thoughtful and systematic about it is important. Not that we should never do it, but that we need to, as with all of these, have a sense of what bias might be included in those phone calls. All right, so I want to just briefly outline an excellent article that actually came out from the Pediatric Surgery Fellowship Program Director group. So I'm going to not overlap too much of what we've already discussed, but I'll go through this briefly. So one thing that's emphasized is using a holistic approach to applicant screening, to not use arbitrary metrics like the fact that somebody is a DO or came from a foreign medical graduate and not just arbitrarily discount those applicants, but to look at every single application that comes through, as difficult as that may be. To think about life experiences and distance traveled, kind of the net change rather than just the final outcome, not just did they go to Harvard, but where did they start and where did they end? And looking at ways that a person might add value to your program beyond just the traditional metrics like research. So what sort of community service did they have versus research? Well, how did they collaborate with people versus how did they lead people? And then really starting with the personal statement, that is the applicant's voice, that is them coming through. And making sure to review these applications with a diverse team without overburdening minorities. There's a minority tax, people unfairly or for free needing to do more work and more representation. And then in preparing for interviews, it's important to look at how does your program display diversity? What does your website look like? How do you communicate through ERAS and Thalamus? What is your messaging like? You know, do you say make sure you wear a suit and tie, or are you being more inclusive? And make sure that all faculty, as many of you have mentioned, go through implicit bias training and take tests so that people who are interviewing understand their own biases. Make sure to do structured interviews. I think we brought up a great point of identifying specific things that your program values and having each interviewer target one of those values so that you can get a very deep view of each applicant. And also you don't sort of ask questions to the mean. So if a person is sitting there trying to answer, they're going to try and find a common ground. And if you're trying to find a common ground with an applicant, you're going to kind of keep recruiting people that look more like your group. And so if you go outside of that, go deeper and have intentional questions that are standardized, so each applicant gets the same set of questions, that can help eliminate some of this bias. And focus on things like integrity, self-awareness, teamwork, leadership. Again, those unstructured interviews may gravitate towards those common interests. And then in creating the rank list, worry that these group conversations can degenerate. They are subjective. Make sure to avoid that subjective discussion. And like you said, nip it in the bud. When somebody says not a good fit, those euphemisms can be very disruptive. Probe deeper, stay curious, dig for what that meaning means. You know, it may be a legitimate thing. This person seemed to lie to me in the interview. Okay, that's probably not a good fit for your program, and a good thing that it's not a good fit for your program, but that euphemism usually doesn't mean that. And worry about these calls as people who are applicants who are connected or in a club may end up benefiting from those calls unfairly. And some things, once you have an underrepresented in medicine's fellow, make sure to help with success and retention once they're in fellowship. There may be social isolation from discrimination or microaggressions. There may be both explicit and implicit bias, and that leads to burnout and turnover and basically loss of retention of these fellows. Make sure you have a support system in place. You can formalize mentorship, and like we were mentioning earlier, race concordant mentorship can really help. And know that people who are underrepresented in medicine are going to be more likely to have unprofessional behavior reported on them, even for the same type of behavior from the majority group. And so make sure we name that bias and support culture change in those situations.
Awesome. Thank you,
All right. Thank you
Morgan,
so
for
much.
that. And we'll go to our third and final case, which Liz Burdan will be presenting for us.
Good morning. I'll spend 10 minutes, hopefully a little less, sharing a little about myself, teaching some of you and reminding others of the challenges of our healthcare culture and the negative impact it has on all of us. I'm Liz Burdan. I'm a pediatric surgeon in Tacoma, Washington, and I'm in my 6th year of practice at Mary Bridge Children's Hospital. I'm married. I have 2 girls. I'm actually sitting in a middle school classroom right now, and I'll be hosting a breakout session on us introducing middle school girls to additional STEM careers. So it's totally an appropriate day today. I grew up on the inner city streets as a foster child. This experience led to my advocacy work on women's leadership and against human trafficking. While I'm a woman surgeon with a background from a low socioeconomic status, this is only my individual experience that I share with you. I do not speak for my whole race, gender, or previous low social class, or even the whole entire DEI committee. My goal here is to inspire you and to encourage discussion, continued discussion on how to bolster the positive culture that is growing at APSA for underrepresented minorities and women. There's an alarming rate of attrition of women physicians across our country from their careers in medicine. Taken in context with the projected physician shortages over the next decade, steps must be taken to mitigate this and improve retention of physicians within our careers. I have to give credit to Pink Coat MD, which is an online community of women physicians founded by women physicians that give access to vetted sources and resources that support other women physicians. I'm going to share a story with you of a personal friend's experience with suicidal ideation. Dr. Tammy Chang is also one of the co-founders of Pink Coat MD. So while this dark story is difficult to talk about, there's a bright spot at the end of the tunnel with which we can all follow Dr. Chang. Within 5 years of her practice, she suffered from severe burnout, not understanding the warning signs and the symptoms. She had severe suicidal ideation. A number of variables happened together that led her down this dark road. After months of collective personal tragedy and a record number of new cancer diagnoses on her service and staffing shortages, and this was prior to COVID-19, a partner of hers struggled with the worst experience of his life as well, his loss of his daughter with metastatic cancer. So Dr. Chang shouldered more and more responsibility, as we all would. We want to step up, we want to support our service, we care about our clinic, our patients, and our partners. This culminated in an on-call weekend when she was leaving the hospital, and the only thing that she could think in her car is, if I just drive my car off the cliff, I don't have to return to work the next day. Fortunately, she stepped on the brake, she stopped her car, she got out, and she called for help. She also founded Pink Coat MD. So in addition to healing herself, she saw the problem as a national crisis, essentially, for women physicians in our culture. Pink Coat MD is an online resource that allows women to have access to high-level resources, including CME. Dr. Tammy Chang and a friend of hers, Dr. Luisa Duran, also wrote a book on how to thrive as a woman physician. Next slide. We are also able to offer and obtain CME from all activities that we are involved with. Next slide. So really what we're talking about is burnout. It's an occupational syndrome caused mainly by characteristics and stressors within the work environment, not deficits in individual resilience. About 80% of physician burnout is really triggered by systemic factors. These systemic factors are in the work environment, organizational culture, and within our professional culture. So what can APSA really impact? It's really our professional culture and leading by example. And oh, by the way, since 2004, we have known, there's data that we've known that women physicians are 2 times more likely to die by suicide compared to women in the general population. The odds are really stacked against us. Women physicians are less likely to rise in leadership positions. There's an article from the Harvard Business Review that was published in 2018 that reminds us that less than 18% of the deans and department chairs across our country in medicine are women. And in the private hospitals, less than 16% of hospital C-suite leaders are women. 40% of women physicians go part-time or quit medicine altogether within 6 years of completing their residency training. That's a huge impact on the physician workforce. So the good news is that APSA, we're already doing a lot of work to support physicians in their practice of pediatric surgery. I definitely recommend increasing the messaging just by putting together this talk, doing the research. It was very difficult to find some of the resources that we already have. We have a wellness committee, we have peer support, APSA physician coaching, but we need to make those resources easily available, reliable, and relatable. They need to be flexible to meet the needs for each person at different levels of their career with the different struggles that they face. We also need to look, I think, outside of pediatric surgery as well. We need to look at the other people that have created their expertise, created their space. At Pink Coat MD, this is an online community that offers leadership development, inspirational speakers, professional coaching, not just physician coaching, but also parent coaching, etc. So we are the transition team. What do I mean by that? We might not even see the changes that we want to see. That's what I mean. We're the transition team. I think that change is possible, and together we can change our medical culture to become kinder, more collaborative, more compassionate, more equal, more diverse, and more inclusive. We've already discussed the difficulties that we face in educating medical students, making that appropriate selection, and training future pediatric surgeons. In order to retain the physicians that we have already trained, we must work together in creating a more inclusive environment. And here's where we need your help, your leadership.
Oops. So clearly there's a pipeline and it's leaking, and there are things that we can do to help prevent this leaking. As leaders in APSA, you are role models that others look up to set standards of acceptable behavior, expectations, and kind of paths that people can follow to become successful. Some of the things that can be done in terms of pipeline building at the individual level are to continue to educate ourselves regarding where we're losing people in the pipeline and how to prevent that. We can be like Liz and participate in career days at our local schools. We can mentor students, work with your hospital to allow shadowing, serve on your alumni panels to help promote diversity in your selection committees and ensure that that's a priority. Volunteer really in the community and just be a presence so that people know that there are opportunities out there in medicine and surgery and pediatric surgery for all people. Within an institutional organizational level, as leaders, you can advocate for and publicize programs that provide exposure and financial assistance to underrepresented students. Publicize mentorship programs that exist. These things are out there, as Liz said, sometimes they're hard to find, and really kind of publicizing the work that you've been a part of or heard about can be very helpful. Work to overhaul your institution's applicant and faculty selection programs or protocols if they're not being done in an inclusive way, and look at promotion systems. As APSA members, we can support and engage with local chapters of the various organizations that exist, like SBAS, Latino Medical Student Association, AWS, to try and reach out to students that are in the pipeline and really show them how great pediatric surgery is, but also that, just medicine is great and that everyone has a role to play. What can the Board of Governors do specifically from some of the things that we talked about today that we wanted to highlight? We can promote diversity, equity, and inclusion as a foundational pillar of APSA and work to make our resources accessible and easy to find. We can consider creating scholarships or travel grants for underrepresented in medicine students and residents if they are struggling with funding. I know a lot of the smaller academic schools or non-academic programs won't fund students to present posters, which, you know, at a highly competitive meeting like APSA, getting a poster is an honor, but students are often unable to come because their schools won't fund them for poster presentation. Consider supporting mentorship programs should APSA have a role in APGARS, given that it does seem to have a national footprint. Encourage all pediatric surgery programs to adopt the APSTPD strategies to mitigate bias during applicant selection, and continue to support programs that create a healthy workforce and retain all members, especially women and underrepresented in medicine, physicians and learners, and help them develop into leaders. And we were able to finish about 5 minutes early, which is awesome because that does give us a little bit of time just to discuss thoughts on the presentation and maybe what APSA can do moving forward. And I'll let Dr. Kendall moderate the discussion.
Dr. Gaines?
That was really interesting and really well done, great information. I think there's one area of the pipeline that you didn't mention that I've noticed is the general surgery resident who initially is interested in pediatric surgery, but by the time they get to their later years, they decide that it's too long, too difficult, too uncertain. And I've had a couple mentees, and interestingly, they've been women who have dropped out of pediatric surgery at that point. So they're going to be general surgeons and continue in general surgery, but pediatric surgery, which had been what they entered into the pipeline interested in, they just thought that the path was just too difficult. And that's been a concern of mine, that as we keep the path to pediatric surgery is difficult. The 2 years or 3 years of other stuff, and then the 2-year fellowship and the having to move for that, and then not the uncertainty of where you're going to get a job once you've done all of that. And for residents, moms with families who are residents and great surgeons, sometimes that's just more than they want to do. So that's one area that I think is something that we as pediatric surgical leaders need to pay attention to, is that leak in the pipeline at that point. I don't know if others have noticed that.
Thank you, Dr. Gaines. Dr. Calkins' comments, I think we've been seeing that in the last few years. He comments that the number of applicants to pediatric surgery have dropped. I'm going to allow myself an incredibly self-serving question, which I'd like to ask to our DEI specialists. And one of my personal experiences is that the group of faculty pediatric surgeons with whom I work are now very unbalanced. Of the 14 members of my group, 10 are women. And so we have achieved an inverse balance, or we find ourselves with an inverse balance. And we might not be the only group that is like it, but it is certainly, different than tradition, and perhaps, reflect something that will emerge as our efforts for mentorship and DEI enhancement progress. And I admit to some personal concern about this because the imbalance is marked. And I wonder if there is counsel from our DEI colleagues about what conditions like this might telegraph and how we might mitigate or address them. Because we certainly don't want to be a hostile or unwelcoming environment to male colleagues. That's not our goal.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. There is a famous quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg saying that we'll know that, women have really made it in terms of equity when all the women on the when all the justices on the Supreme Court are women, because it was so long acceptable that all the men, the justices were men. And I think that's an interesting point that she made. I do think that we have to kind of be aware of the balance in our programs. I think it would be maybe something interesting to look at in terms of seeing like at which places is that happening and maybe why is it happening? Like why are there some programs that are all male and why are there programs that are all more predominantly female, and what are driving those changes and how we can kind of level it out.
Thank you. Dr. Hayes-Dixon?
Yes, thank you for that nice presentation. And one of the things I wanted to highlight, and thank you for bringing up the suicide issue, because it is such a touchy issue and we really need to make sure that we're sensitive to our colleagues that might be going through extremes of depression. But what I wanted to highlight and have us think about is the leaky pipeline when it comes to the residents that are African-American and Latino primarily. The ACGME data shows that if you're African-American, you're 5 times as likely to be dismissed from a residency program. And if you're Latino, 3 times as likely. And so if we can't even get them through the residency programs, obviously we're never going to get them to pediatric surgeons. And although you summarized a lot of the great things that we can do, quite honestly, a lot of the issue and the people being dismissed that I experienced at one of my previous institutions was there was just frank racism. And I think what we can do as pediatric surgeons who are part of a general surgery program to make sure that you're listening and looking for things like that. And more importantly, listening, because the program directors don't always get the information because some of the residents are either the program director isn't supportive or the residents worried about repercussions by reporting it to the program director. And I was just really shocked when I started to ask the minority residents in a protected session we had on Zoom to just describe some of the things that have been happening to them. And it was awful. There was a couple of attendings who were telling who were not training the African-American male resident. So, he was doing a good job on my service. I thought he was doing great. But on the other services, for example, the attending actually pulled a white resident off of another service to do a complex case with him because he didn't want to operate with the Black male resident. And he started to ask his colleagues, this resident, hey, does Dr. So-and-so let you take down the splenic flexure laparoscopically, blah, blah, blah? Does he let you do the whole total colectomy? And was finding that he was being treated more like an intern as a senior resident and was not being allowed to operate. And we won't find out about these things unless we ask, because the residents are not going to volunteer them. They just want to get through. Most of them just want to put their head down and get done. But I think our responsibility as pediatric surgeons, obviously we're still surgeons, is to help these underrepresented minorities get through their residency programs in the places that we are. And that involves more than just sort of, I'm available, come open my office door. But you really have to reach out to them and get them to talk to you about their experiences in a confidential environment. And then you as a faculty has to decide what to do with that information, of course. But I think we can really make an impact on the leaky pipeline at the residency level if we all take that responsibility in our general surgery residency programs.
I think that's an incredibly valuable comment from, someone with a dean's level perspective, but being a truly active listener is, I think, or as Tom Tracy put in the chat, being intentional about our listening is incredibly important.
Right, exactly.
Dr. Sullins?
Yeah, no, I think that I echo the comments already. I think that our intentionality about this is super important, and it's not just putting it on all of the people who are diverse themselves, but it's actually almost more important to have the leaders who are white male majority, white, cisgender, all of that, to be the people who end up speaking out and advocating for everything else. Just to comment on a couple of other things, there's a famous business school study where they looked at a group of 5 people to see, in terms of gender relationships, how the group felt most listened to and worked best together. And of that group of 5, they changed the variability of numbers of females versus males, and the group worked better when there were 4 females and 1 male. So just to answer that question, I know, and actually didn't work well with 5 females. So and that may just be in business. Obviously, it might be different in different workspaces, but that's a study that's often quoted in business school. And that was just with male and female, not with different racial backgrounds or ethnicities or any different backgrounds. I agree with Liz about the last point of us being the transition, for this change. And I think we really need to be deliberate about DEI efforts. And one of the things that has come up at UCLA has been kind of an overhaul of the entire health system, where we have health system and School of Medicine dollars, so actual money that has been put aside to reward and academically protect and reward the work and the time spent in this, because we can't be the people that advocate if we have 0 time protected for it and 0 reward, because when it's not necessarily research and publications and all of that. It's the time that you spend doing all of these little things and mentorship and all of that. And so I think in general, nationwide, there's been an effort to reward mentorship, because people have recognized that's a huge part of education and making sure that we're mitigating burnout and advocating for promotion and diversity. But I think Jedi work should be included in all of that. So those are just a few comments. And thank you to the presenters.
Yes, I think we really have to thank our presenters, because we've imprisoned them for a very long time on a Saturday morning. So I'm just but this is a topic which is really, foundational, I think, to the efforts of the APSA community. I think I'll ask Dr. Arca for the last comment for this group, and then we should release you.
Sure. I just wanted to address the 2 things. One is the pipeline actually starts with the children of our communities, and we started with the medical school, and I think that's part of the work of APGAR as well. But we need, once they get to med school, there's a bunch of milestones, right? That you get there, and so probably something that we should think about, and it's somehow related to social determinants and everything else. The second thing that I kind of wanted to talk about is this pipeline between residency and pediatric surgery. It is a long haul. As Dr. Poligondla says, now we're actually saying, oh, if you did the surgical critical care fellowship or fetal fellowship or whatever that might be. But I kind of wanted to just re-highlight a program that the Pediatric Surgery Board had put together with the ACGME, which is this 7-year clinical pathway from general surgery to pediatric surgery. I think up till now, I don't know, Dr. Poligondla, you could tell me, but are there just only 2 programs that has taken advantage of that? Where if you really don't want to do the semi-mandatory 2 years of training, that you could, some programs can take advantage of this so that you could just train somebody through for 7 years without doing whatever you do not think is necessary, and maybe not a mandatory checklist so that you could get an interview for pediatric surgery fellowship.
Thank you, Dr. Arca. I want to sincerely thank all our DEI teachers, Dr. Martin, Dr. Burden. I didn't acknowledge you initially. For some reason, you weren't on our agenda, but we're incredibly lucky that you were part of our teacher group. Dr. Richards, Dr. Cockrell, thank you all. This has been really thoughtful and valuable. And I think, we will be discussing this and using this to enrich the work of the board going forward. So my sincere thanks, and please take the whole rest of the day off.